Senate Bill 132, and if Adam Rosenberg is here, Adam, why don't you come on up? I'll just quickly introduce the bill. This is one that we have seen before, actually for many years when Senator Shank was here. We had work groups on this when we were both in the House, and so this bill has been around for a long time and has to do with the failure to report for mandatory reporters. Originally, this bill years and years ago came in there are, as you all know, under the law, people that are required under the law to report, and the sanction for failing to do so, and it's a reasonable standard, a negligence standard. The punishment for failing to do so has to do with their licenses. And so the issue always was there are a number, I think most other states have some criminal sanction for failing to report. The question is, at what level do you want to do that? I personally had always opposed the idea, as it originally came in, of saying just simply turning the civil sanction into a criminal sanction, because that would wrap in folks who are simply negligent, or So what we had come up with in this committee, and I think prior, maybe Adam, you remember more than I, maybe back in the House, had come up with the idea we really wanted to if we were going to do this, wrap in folks who knew. They clearly knew that something was going on and turned either a blind eye or just, allowed this to go on when they had actual knowledge of it. So the bill that's before you does exactly that. If a mandatory reporter has actual knowledge or witnesses the act of abuse, then they will, and they fail to report, then they would be subject to a criminal sanction. There's a corollary bill that's going to come next having to do with training, which I always thought was kind of the more important of the two issues, is to make sure people knew what they were supposed to be looking at. That would probably help more, but we'll get into that afterwards. Anyway, that's the bill that's before you. It's about as tight as you can make it. I think it's probably the tightest of any of the states that have it. So there you go. That's 132. Dolores?
Mr. Chairman, I would say that your bill takes care of the situation up at Penn State, this Sadusky case, where there were coaches that actually saw what was happening. There are other kinds of cases that this bill is not attempting to help, but I think it's a good one for what you're dealing with.
Yeah.
Okay.
The idea was, there's a whole range of things you could do. Then I think somebody will probably talk about the idea of, quote, willful blindness, because there was some case law on that. There's negligence all the way to, malice. There's really the whole range of cases you could come up with. This is as tight as it can get, right? This is saying you knew and you did nothing about it, then you're on the hook for this criminal sanction.
So this one is not even about the mandatory reporters. That's another issue, that we do have certain occupations in Maryland that
these are required reporters, right? This only deals with the required reporters.
Oh, this is dealing with just them.
Right. So the Penn State case, I believe that guy under our law would be a mandatory reporter, was an educator. So
I believe so.
I believe he was a university official, so he was a man. He was the guy who walked in, I believe, was a man. At least under our law would be a man. I don't know about Pennsylvania law.
I would say that only Maryland and I think at this point Wyoming don't have some kind of sanction, even for the mandatory reporters who were not there and do not have this kind of first-hand knowledge. So maybe in another year you'll want to go further and deal with these other folks.
Just for the record, this was Senator Kelly's issue forever. Back when I was in the House, I think it was your bill when you were over here. So anyway, Senator Lee.
I think it was something that Senator Kelly already addressed. Isn't Maryland one of just two states that doesn't have any kind of penalty?
That's correct. That only Maryland and Wyoming.
For failure to report by those that are required by statute to report.
That's right.
That's correct?
Yes.
Okay. I think this bill is the language that I see here is pretty tweeted, because you actually have to have actual knowledge, or and you didn't do anything. I don't know how better it can get. You witness it, get actual knowledge. I don't know what else we could do. And this fine isn't this misdemeanor and $1,000? Isn't it quite low compared to other states?
It's reasonable compared to other states. Some states have made this a felony. Some states have significantly higher fines and penalties. It's reasonable and on the lower side as well. And I think indicative of what the punishment should be in this kind of criminal failure.
Well, I thank the advocates for supporting this bill all the years that we've brought it, and I hope that we can pass it this year. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, and certainly on that note, to thank all of you for having supported this bill. Certainly, Senator Kelly, thank you for championing this issue for well over a decade, and Senator Zirkin and Lee for sponsoring the bill and bringing it forward this year. This is the same bill as last year, which passed this body unanimously, only to die across the street in the House. The only thing that's really changed between last year and this year is that we've worked with many of other people who have been involved in this bill and have gotten their support, or they've changed their position where they had formerly opposed it there. You'll see in your packet of testimony the Maryland chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics now supports this bill. MedChi and the Maryland Nursing Association, who had opposed the bill in the past, they are remaining silent on the bill. And MSEA, the teachers union, they are not opposing it last year, nor did they oppose it this year, and they didn't oppose it last year as well. So there are a number of organizations that find that this is the solution in the middle there that I think adequately and fairly protects those professionals from unwanted prosecution, but also provides the appropriate penalty for the most egregious cases. And that's the other thing we've seen in the last year. We looked at these terrible cases that came out, the Vigna case, the Caraway case, and we've seen those results come out in the news where there are numerous people, superintendents and principals, who had multiple examples and incidents in children, telling them and witnessing abuse, and it was still allowed to pervade. This closes that loop, and I think that you have a copy of this in your packet. It's sort of the cap on a pyramid of child protection structures. At the bottom is education, letting mandated reporters know what their responsibility is. That is the 131 bill. Reason to believe is the standard in Maryland Family Law 5-704, the existing system in place. The bill passed 2 years ago, proposed by Delegates Dumais and Raskin, was the notification towards licensing boards and employers that people should be terminated. And at the very top is this standard that Senator Lee just talked about, this knowing failure of criminal knowledge of this abuse there, which is really embodied, I think, also by the fact that this is what we saw in the Vigna case, that at the very top of that reporting system there is a superintendent in Montgomery County who regrettably had learned multiple incidents that Vigna had done and sent a letter of reprimand to Vigna, which is also in your packet. And it addresses such an egregious failure. There was so much damning information about this, and the man was still allowed to teach, and I believe actually still has his license, which says that there are just some instances when there are people who we trust to watch and take care of our children haven't done that responsibly. And that's why it makes this very high standard there to be able to enact it in the worst of worst cases. And so I truly appreciate the fact that we've made it to this point, and hopefully we can get this across the street and work towards passage so we can put this issue to bed once and for all. But I thank you, certainly on behalf of all the work that you do and the work that we do to protect children, and I'm available for other questions as well.
I agree with the sponsor and with you that for what this bill is about, it ought to be passed. I'm concerned, however, if you look at your own pyramid, it's that tiny little subset of the mandatory reporters that this bill affects, those who actually have firsthand knowledge they saw.
Right.
And I'm hoping that some of us can get together to work by next year on the multiplicity of mandatory reporters who aren't going to have that firsthand knowledge, but who in Maryland don't have any mandate for not, any punishment at all.
Thank you, Senator
Not
Kelly.
even a fine if they don't do anything when they get
I certainly agree, and I think that what we've seen, I think this bill represents that consensus up until this point, that the appetite of both legislators and advocates and professionals in the field have led to this pyramid that exists there. And so many of those are ideally aimed to be covered by the Dumais-Raskin bill with this notification requirement to the licensing boards there. But there are just some cases, as you point out, that demand more. And so certainly, this is the right start.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senators.
All right, what do we got here? We've got Joyce Lombardi.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll stand down. Everything is covered by Mr. Rosenberg.
Thank you so much. Okay, Bailey Condrey.
Good afternoon, Chair Zirkin and Vice Chair Kelly. I'm the first vice president of the Montgomery County Civic Federation. As a group, an umbrella organization, we represent about 150,000 people in the county of Montgomery. Today I'm testifying in support of the bill, but we would like amendments because our reading of the bill is quite different from the conversation I've just heard. Under the criminal law section on page 2, line 4, we'd like to have actual knowledge changed to any knowledge or information about the abuse or neglect. Under the criminal law section on page 2, line 5, number 2, witnesses the act of the abuse or neglect should be deleted entirely. Under the criminal law section on page 2, lines 9 and 10, this section applies only to a failure to report child abuse that occurs during the time the child is a minor, should be deleted entirely. We hold these ideas because in the last instance, what we're now learning about the USA Gymnastics team had the final section, it must occur during the time the child is a minor. Half of the witnesses in the Larry Nassar case would not be allowed to testify, as they're now, many of them, adults. What is occurring in Montgomery County is a situation where reporters are not allowed to report.
Before you do that, before you move on from that, why wouldn't they be allowed to testify?
They lose their jobs. Oh, in the gymnastics case? Because they're now 21 years old.
This doesn't say that the individual can't testify. That doesn't say anything of the kind. It just simply says that somebody, if there's abuse that occurs when the individual is a minor, that the teacher, for instance, who didn't report it, all of a sudden it's 20 years later, we're not going to criminalize their, it's the failure to report, it's the reporter that wouldn't be criminalized if it didn't take place when the child is a minor. It has nothing to do with the individual testifying, or for that person testifying for that matter.
Well, I stand corrected, but a number of us read this a number of times, and we could not come up with another way that would allow the victims in the USA Gymnastics case to be heard in court because they didn't fit this description. Unless we
Respectfully,
misread it.
you read it incorrectly, but go ahead, continue.
So you have before you a database of 51 cases in Montgomery County, and the situation is that many of the reporters are not allowed to report to the police or to Child Protective Services. The principals become gatekeepers, and if you force the gatekeepers to have all of the actual knowledge of an event, that's humanly impossible for them to get a handle on because they can't be in all places at all times in a school system. So there are 51 cases as an attachment to the testimony of child abuse cases in Montgomery County Public Schools alone that will not, we don't believe the situation will be corrected if the language in the bill is not amended.
Ask you a question.